All right, so I'm here this afternoon with Sue Kedgley. Sue, can you just please confirm with a verbal yes that you give permission for this interview?
I do, yes.
Thank you. All right. The first block of questions is titled The Background About Your Life. And so as you think about where you are today, how would you depict the journey that brought you to this point? So things like central commitments, what your career looks like, and maybe one or two significant lifetime achievements that you've had professionally.
Well, I think probably, although I had a very sheltered upbringing in New Zealand in the 1950s and 60s, I think I was probably a sort of born activist. You know, at school, etc., I was something of a rebel. And then when I got to university in 1965 or something, I immediately got myself onto the student executive. So things like that, which was highly unusual for women in those days, because the university was very much a male enclave. And we were there to, basically women went to university to at best get a sort of an interim job, but primarily to try to snare a husband and become an educated wife, because it was absolutely, you know, clear indoctrinated into us from our childhood that really a woman's role was to you know, look good and you know, get a husband and live vicariously through our husband, taking on his name. And in fact, right up until the 70s, well, certainly the mid 60s anyway, a woman was expected to give up her work if she had it, either when she got married or certainly when she had a child, and spend the rest of her life living through her husband and, you know, obeying him, actually, as it was spelled out very clearly in the wedding vow. So, you know, that was why one went to university. And it was only when I went to university, then by varying reasons, I spent a year after I'd done 4 years at university. I went to help friends set up a Asia Pacific research unit, went across the Pacific, which was pretty exciting and interesting in those days, because some of the countries were only just emerging from colonial rule. But I picked up this book as I was coming back to New Zealand to finish my master's at Auckland University, called Sisterhood is Powerful by Robin Morgan, which I still have a copy of it. And it was literally just reading, you know, I got off the plane flat, was staying with a friend of mine, and the two of us, we just sat up all night reading this book. And that really, it was just like everything suddenly, I had what they call a feminist click, all fell into place. And that was it really. And then, you know, I said, oh, where's the Women's Liberation Group? There wasn't one. So I set one up in Auckland University, and from there on in, I became a sort of feminist activist, and then ended up at the UN and working in the Women's Secretariat there, which was fascinating. And, you know, for International Women's Year and the International Women's Year Conference. And that was extraordinary, because it was the first time ever in the world that women from all around the world, from every nation on earth, gathered together to discuss women's issues. And of course, you know, there was a lot of men trying to control women, and you know, the conference being taken over by other agendas. But nevertheless, the fact that all these women came together and were discussing what were the issues about, you know, that concerned us, and then this huge, exciting forum in Mexico, where women from all around the world got together. And that really, it it did trigger a lot. I mean, if you look at the sort of the shoots that emerged from that conference, it had a huge impact, really, in hindsight. So that was all very exciting, and it set me really on a feminist path. And I'd say that was what a lot of my life has been about, but not all of it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that, what happened then after this? What does the rest of your career look like? You've talked about your feminist path, but we've stopped about in the 1980s, have we?
Yes. Well, I mean, I was heavily involved in the UN Women's Group, right. And as I say, I worked in that Women's Secretariat, etc. But after 8 years, I had well, various things triggered it, but anyway, I sort of decided to go back to New Zealand. And well, I was sort of thinking about it, and then my mother had a car accident. I went back, took a leave of absence, and ended up back in New Zealand. And then I got a job with Television New Zealand as a reporter, and then a director and producer and whatever. And then eventually, at age 40, I think I was 41 or 42, I got married and had a child. And then ended up in politics, first of all in local politics, and then as a Green MP for 12 years, and then, in more, regional politics. So really, I ended up having a sort of career in politics. And that's, really until this day, that's sort of been what my career has been.
Right. And so you were Wellington City Council, correct, for a while, and then in the Green Party, which is a national political party in New Zealand. I just have to make these sometimes explanations for people who are not. Well,
certainly in America, a Green Party is a very foreign, and I know someone who was trying to a friend of mine was trying to get into Stanford University, and he mentioned that he had worked for me as an intern, and I was a Green MP, and the entire interview was about, there's a Green Party in New Zealand, and so that's how he always thinks that's how he got into Stanford University. So I'm aware that that's quite unusual in the context of America. But yes, I was part of the first 7 Green MPs who entered the New Zealand Parliament under proportional representation. Yeah. So we were the first Green MPs, and I was there for 12 years. And I was the women's spokesperson. But particularly, I was also interested in safe food, animal welfare. I'd written books on food issues, eating safely in a toxic world. So I had other environmental agendas. Right. But it was, and just trying to be, at that stage, women made up 1/3 of the New Zealand Parliament. I'm very happy to say they now make up 50%. But it still was very, very much a overwhelmingly male culture, male environment, confrontational, very much based on a sort of polarizing, acrimonious parliament, which was sort of, a very alien to my culture. So it took quite a while to learn and adapt to this environment. It was rather hard to change it. Right. I think now that there's almost 50% of women, things are significantly starting to change in the New Zealand Parliament. But, for the first, I think, 160, for a long time, New Zealand Parliament effectively had no women. It was only in the 1970s that more than 1 or 2 women started to enter the Parliament. So it was a very alien institution. Yes,
very much modelled on the English.
Where for 600 years, the British Parliament had no women. So they basically began as sort of men's clubs. And it did, but in many respects, it was like a men's club. And women, were not allowed to enter significant parts of the parliament, and it was a cosy men's club. So, and I think basically, you know, I mean, I don't know at what point we divert into the 6,000 years of patriarchy, but
Right.
I think, you know, I wrote a book called 50 Years of Feminist, and I think perhaps the most important chapter is talking about the fact that the whole context of the women's movement is that we were up against this, whether it's 6,000 or 10,000 years of patriarchy, in which the world was sort of divided into different spheres for men and women. And what fascinated me was that this is in almost every culture, religion in the world. This has happened. And women's place was in the home, men owned the public sphere, men controlled our public life, men, you know, decided the whole public sphere was sort of men's domain. And so men, you know, really there has been a lot of difficulty for women entering, especially the early women, entering the public sphere, entering the political domain, because women were seen as intruders into, you know, this male club. So all the early women who went into, you know, it wasn't easy unless you just capitulated, conformed, and became one of the boys. But if you didn't do that, it was really very difficult. And you know, it's interesting to me that, you know, all over the world, the political sphere, you know, men dominate parliaments in every single country of the world. You know, women have the separation of women into the home has happened all over the world. The assumption that men are superior and that our role is to be subordinate to men and to look after them, that is in almost every single religion and culture in the world. So I found that deeply fascinating, and I realized that in 1975 at the International Women's Year Conference, and it's fascinated me ever since. I mean, you know, I suppose racism is also a global phenomenon, but the fact that every single religion, you know, with no exception, has adopted this mindset, these values, I found extraordinary.
So, so a couple of things. I have read your book, 50 Years of Feminist. Thank you. Thanks for writing it. It was a very good read. And I wanted to ask you, so how did you go about making your own path in this male-dominated world? What was your mechanism? Did you become one of the boys, or were you like, what did you do that defined who you were as a person in Parliament?
Well, I never had a sort of career plan, which people are advised to have these days. Everything was sort of happened more or less by accident, right? If I look back over my entire career, including getting into Parliament. I had no ambition to go into Parliament at all. And I was a city councillor and a safe food campaigner. I'd set up the safe food campaign, written books, and I was campaigning on genetic engineering and so forth. And someone rang me and said, would I put my name on a list? And I said, sure, you know, if that's all right. At that point, the Greens had absolutely no chance of getting into Parliament. We were polling at 0%. And so suddenly, and it was literally at the very last minute, that suddenly the Greens got over what was a particular threshold, and we ended up in Parliament. The whole thing was by accident. So there was no preparation, there was no, you know, thinking about it and preparing myself. I just sort of fell into it. But having got there, I had nevertheless been a campaigner all my life, from being a campaigner for women, and then I was campaigning on safe food issues, and having been a city councillor and so forth. I was good at campaigning, so I just sort of thought, oh well, I'll just use the greater resources, etc., that are available to me in Parliament, and I'll just carry on doing what I'm doing, which is campaigning on key issues. And effectively, that's what I did. Although I did again only by chance, not because I wanted to. I was made chair of the Health Select Committee, so I was in a that was a reasonably influential position in our parliament. And I had a private member's bill, you know, I got through Parliament, but I mean, I managed to, I negotiated with the government to get healthy food guidelines right through, which would require that only healthy food was sold in schools right around New Zealand, and this went through and was accepted. And you know, I thought how wonderful, I've actually made a difference. You know, we've spent 3 years working on this, and now only healthy food is being sold in schools around New Zealand. It wasn't quite as black and white as that, but it was, you know, and then suddenly there was a change of government. The National Party came in, and their very first act, they said it was nanny state to suggest what children should eat at school and that they should only eat healthily. It was completely ridiculous. And so they, in one fell swoop, just got rid of them. And so, you know, 3 years of effort was down the drain. And all the schools went back to selling pies and Coke. And so in contributing to the obesity and poor dental health and poor nutrition of the subsequent generations of New Zealand children. So I also learnt the limits of power. You know, everyone thinks, oh, going into Parliament, how fabulous. But there are many things where you finally achieve something only to find it, you know, eliminated by the next, you know, by the next government that sweeps into power. Mm. So anyway, I know I had no real preparation, and certainly I never focused on becoming one of the boys. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I left the United Nations, because I was a permanent international civil servant and could have had a career at the United Nations, as many of my friends did.
Right.
But, and I was on the fast track and had, you know, what do they call them? Accelerated promotions and things. So I left all that behind. So I've never been on that, you know, that's never been something that's attracted me.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I guess, so we didn't sort of touch on the most significant lifetime achievement. Is there one, or are there many that you would consider naming?
Well, I suppose one would say having, you know, one's child was perhaps the most significant, and also the fact that my son is you know, is a great chef and respects women, and you know, so there's some success in that era, in that area. And what other? No, I would say raising. Really, I think perhaps the most significant thing I would have said I did was helping to usher in the women's liberation movement in New Zealand, and raising awareness and getting the whole movement sort of up and running here in New Zealand was probably, if I look back, that's probably the most significant thing. And then once it was up and running, it just developed a momentum of its own. But in those early days, it was pretty hard slog.
Yeah, I bet. So we'll go into the second block of questions now, and it's really the background about your work. And I guess you've had, it seems like, you know, the women's movement is one strand of work, and perhaps being a public figure is another strand of work, and also working for healthy food or healthy choice or health in general is another. So I'll leave it up to you which you choose, but what drew you to that work initially?
Well, no, as I've said, most of my things were completely by accident.
Oh, right.
I mean, so including even becoming a Wellington City Councillor. I had no, actually, I loved being a reporter at Television New Zealand.
Right.
I was offered that job. I loved it. That would be my favourite job. But unfortunately, I got talked into 2 or 3 different people all said, look, you would be a wonderful producer and director, and sent me off on this producers and directors course, which I didn't like at all. I loved being a reporter and going out and interviewing people and exploring issues. So I got talked into becoming a director, which I didn't like at all. And then, instead of just going to someone saying, look, can I go back to being a reporter, I was sort of waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder. And of course, it never happened. So eventually I left Television New Zealand, and I became an independent, I made some independent documentaries and whatever. But then I had the child and took a year off. And then someone asked me, would I stand for the city council? And I said, oh, I'm busy. I was busy. Actually, I was writing a book, The History of Motherhood in New Zealand. Right. At the time, I said, no, I'm tied up with this, thanks. And I didn't think any more of it. Then literally 3 nights in a row, I dreamt that I was standing on the green team for the city council. And by the 3rd night, I think my subconscious is trying to tell me something. So I agreed to stand. So it was as random as that. So that was how I became a city councillor. Parliament, it was just a complete accident. So really, most of my life has been, and becoming a TV person, well, that was because someone offered me that job in New York. They said, if you come back to New Zealand, we'll give you a job in Television New Zealand. So funnily enough, when I was at the UN, one of my women friends, organised for the first feminist business college in America. These women called Hennig and Jardim, and they had set up a feminist business school in America. I think it was in Boston. And they came and spoke to us, and they were basically taking the line that the whole problem for women was that we had to understand that we were entering a sort of alien environment, an environment that men had grown up in, men had absorbed by osmosis. It was basically a male world with male values. And they said, it's almost like you're learning a new language. Like if you went to Greece, you've got to learn how to speak Greek and adapt to their languages. This is how women had to approach going into the male world. And so they advised us all, you must develop this 5 and 10 year plan, and you must, learn to adapt to the male world and fit in with the male values and so forth. And actually, I completely rejected that. And part of the reason I rejected that all along was Germaine Greer, whom I had organised to visit New Zealand when I was a women's liberationist. One of her big things was that women must beware of just gaining free entry to the world of the ulcer and the coronary. And they said, we must not just, revolution is not just becoming, one of the boys. It is challenging every aspect of that predominant culture. So I always, right from when I heard Germaine Greer, which was in 1972 when she came out to New Zealand, and I spent, I think, 10 days with her, that's always been my approach. So I was never swayed, because that was a very predominant strand of women going into the male. And then we're all learning assertiveness training, dressing for success. It was all about women. Right. Our problem was that we had to adapt to the world, and any of the problems that we encountered were because we hadn't dressed sufficiently for success, or we hadn't been assertive. It was all our problem. We just had to fit in. And that's something I've always rejected. But it is still quite a predominant theme.
Yeah, I think that viewpoint has different viewpoints now, and is certainly changing. But I certainly understand what you're talking about, having grown up with that very much. And Germaine Greer was obviously a big name when I was a child as well. And for those that don't know, she was a very famous Australian feminist. She's not still with us, is she?
Yes, she is. Absolutely.
Oh my gosh.
She
Yeah.
predominantly lives in, she's bought a farm that she's converting into native forest outside of
Right.
Brisbane. She's become a passionate ecologist.
Oh, that's
But she
right.
does, and she's sort of become a bit more eccentric as she's got older, and she's published some rather controversial, to say the least, things. She wrote a book on rape when she was more or less saying, well, it's not such a big deal, that rape wasn't such a big deal and so forth, which caused enormous controversy. So she's become more controversial as she's got older.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And that's right. You mentioned her in her book, Life Circumstances, and how has your life changed given your work circumstances? So this bi-directional idea of change between life and work, I guess, is what that we'd like you to talk about.
Well, I think, I've been an activist all my life, and my work has been my activism, and in a way I'm still continuing it now, through voluntary you could say through voluntary activism, through things like the National Council of Women.
Right.
So I think that for me, it's all I've always been motivated by, in some way, trying to change. I'm sort of a change maker, trying to change things, I'd have to feel passionate about something. Right, I wouldn't. The idea of just doing some job that I didn't really care about, what was never really on the agenda. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I left the UN. I ended up in a particular job, and it went very well for a while. Then I got this terrible British bully boss, and I thought, well, I'm not going to put up with that. But anyway, no. So I'd say that I think my work has just been an extension of my activism, and I've been very fortunate to have careers all the way through, even as a reporter. I mean, I made 4 women or feminist documentaries. I produced a documentary about the life of Catherine Mansfield. But so all of, there's been a sort of consistent theme throughout my life. And I guess I've been very fortunate, really, to have found work in areas, where I could continue my, if you like, my political work, my activism. And so I've been very privileged to be able to work in that space. So I don't really think my work has changed me. I think it's just been an extension of who I am. Right.
Yeah. Perhaps different focus of things. So, the health work, or the, healthy food work is slightly different from the feminist focus, but that.
Yes, but again, it was like seeing the atrocious food that was on offer for children, and thinking, this is just ridiculous. It was laced with with chemicals, the junk food that was targeted at children. And so then, someone suggested we set up a group called the Safe Food Campaign to try to improve the food on offer for children. So it was the same sort of thing, that, trying to change some aspect of our society.
Yeah. So it's a small point, but I wanted to go back to your reporting days. What was, for those who haven't read your book and who don't know, what was the reason for you not being terribly encouraged to actually be a reporter, to be on camera, to be an anchor?
No, in the early days, there wasn't any problem there at all. I got a job. I was given. It is true that the head of one of the top guys had met me and said, I'll get you a job in New Zealand. And then what I didn't realize is that this created enormous resentment, that I would become, as it were, parachuted in, rather than having gone through what was I suppose, journalism school or something. Anyway,
Right.
so I was this boss who was sort of more or less told to hire me, I guess, although I was offered 2 different jobs I had to choose. He said he put me on the bottom possible rung, ignored 10 years of experience, of work experience, and made me go right down to the very bottom of the ladder. But nevertheless, I then quickly got promoted from being a local reporter into a national reporter. So no, I didn't experience discrimination, other than that my pay would have been a fraction of what all my male peers were getting. And it was rationalized that because people resented my coming into the organization as a reporter, that I had to start at the very bottom of the you know, as a sort of almost lower than a trainee journalist.
Yeah, I guess I'm referring to there the line that I can't remember who fed you, that it was that women's voices weren't suited for reporting.
Oh, that was much earlier. My very first job when I left university in 1969 or something was at the radio program Checkpoint. And there I was given a job as a researcher. And then at one point, I was researching for guys I'd been at university with. They were the same age, they were my peers at university. And I was running around doing research for them. And at one point I said, you know, is there any chance of actually being a reporter myself or doing some interviews? And they said, absolutely no way. You know, women's voices are not deep or authoritative enough. And there's no way that women can be in current affairs. But by the time I'd come back, because women's liberation, of course, challenged all of that. And because, I mean, what I think is so important is that there is we had a massive women's liberation movement in New Zealand. And, you know, for a decade, it was, you know, it was a very intense activism. And it changed attitudes and challenged attitudes. And even though they've taken, you know, they linger on, but there was that challenging of attitudes and values. And what I've observed in areas where that hasn't happened, say just for example, our Pacific neighbours, they've never had a women's movement. So everyone's trying to, you know, change, because for example, in Papua New Guinea, there was been no women in their parliament. So people are trying to change that, but unless there's been a women's movement, attitudes are still stuck in this, you know, no one's challenged the basic sort of patriarchal mindset and the idea that, you know, women's places in the home. So all through the Pacific, people are trying to promote women in parliament and women in this, and it's incredibly slow and very a huge struggle, because they've never actually had a grassroots women's movement in their country. And I think that's true, particularly in, you know, some Arab countries and so forth. And I noticed, for example, in Japan, they're just starting to get a sort of grassroots movement. So some woman says she starts a petition saying that to stop, not to require all women to wear high heels to work. And that takes off and it becomes this whole sort of grassroots movement. And then someone else said that we shouldn't have to wear glasses to work to make ourselves look more authoritative. And that becomes, so they're sort of doing a bit of a grassroots thing in Japan now 50 years later.
Right.
But without that sort of campaign to challenge attitudes, and it's very hard to really fundamentally change society. And that's why I think that that early activism, which we now look back on and take for granted, is so incredibly important. And of course, that's what happened in America and in Australia and in Canada and England. But in many parts of the world, that's never taken place.
Right. Yeah. Yes. So good. We'll touch again on the international sort of connections that you see later on. But I wanted to move on to the third lot of questions that we have now. And the first, it's really we've covered a lot of this, but it's titled Reflections on Your Work. And so the first question is, how do you understand the term feminism, and what has it meant to your work? And I think you've made that fairly clear, but what's your understanding of feminism in quotation marks, if you like?
Yeah, well, every generation sort of reinvents feminism, and I mean, I think basically it's about women refusing to accept the subordinate position and to accept that somehow they're inferior to men, and it's demanding that women are treated equally, that we're that our life is not to please men and to run the home, and to open up and opportunities throughout society. But I'm sort of, and every generation reinvents feminism, and that's fine by me. I think it's you tend to take up issues which are particularly important to you at a particular time in your life. So for lesbian feminists, obviously lesbian feminism was, their passion. Abortion is a huge issue if that's illegal. Right now in New Zealand, I would argue that misogynistic abuse was a big feminist issue. Like the whole internet has now become a new vehicle of male violence, really, towards women. And so, like when I was a feminist, there was no internet. So now that becomes the new one of the new focuses of feminist priority, is trying to, for example, focus on the internet. But whereas on the other hand, the internet has sparked a whole, what some people call the third or fourth wave of feminism, because it has enabled young women to link up with women all over the world and to connect with women right around the world. So it's been an incredible boost to feminism, but it's also a huge problem for young women growing up today.
Right.
And also, I mean, the other thing that I still feel, I wrote a book in 1973 called Sexist Society, which was the first women's liberation book in New Zealand. And in that book, Sharon Cederman and myself predicted, we said, well, as women entered the paid world of work and contributed financially in the home, we predicted that men would then share equally in the child rearing and the running of the home. And of course, that never happened. It's finally starting grudgingly to happen. So to me, a huge issue still of unfinished business is getting men to share equally in shared parenting and sharing in the home. And I think that's only going to happen if we follow the example of Scandinavia, where parental leave is offered equally to men and women. And if the men don't take it, they lose that parental leave. And so that's completely legitimized and normalized shared parenting in those countries, so that I think it's something like 40% of parental leave is now taken by men. And once men start being involved in bringing up babies, that sets the ground for shared parenting. But for all of these decades, it's been women running the home, bringing up the children, and then having this, having two jobs effectively. And so it's called the motherhood penalty, and it's women have been penalised for the past half century in the workplace, struggling to and if they take time out to have children, then they're penalised and they're getting back into the work. They never catch up with their peers. I think in New Zealand, women at retirement age have about 20% less in superannuation. So, that women never sort of catch up. And so that's a huge issue too.
Yeah. So we've got this, not just the moral obligation, but a structural obligation. So it's almost a shame, I guess, to think about that the structural obligation with a, like, you know, having shared parental leave needs to be in place before we can actually see the public face of the moral obligation to shared parenting, you know, as an example. Yeah. Okay, I'm thinking, so the rest of this question asks about your relationship with other members in your own organisation and expectations for your organisation's future. Is there a particular organisation you would want to choose and to answer those questions, or should we just move on?
Maybe move on.
Okay.
You know, I could talk about women's liberation in the early days, or, you know, the National Council of Women now, but, you know.
Right, and there's lots of other questions that we should really get through. So the fourth lot of questions is about the relationship between, or how you perceive the relationship between feminist scholarship and activism. So, so I'll ask that. How do you perceive the relationship between scholarship and activism? So in general, but also for you personally.
Well, I'd sort of, if we define scholarship loosely, I mean, I think those early feminist texts were hugely important and influential, and I don't think that we really would have a women's movement in New Zealand were it not for Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch, Robin Morgan's Sexist Society, Kate Millett. You know, those books were so profound. And it was almost like we had been all so indoctrinated to see ourselves as inferior, to think that our only role in life really was to please men, to be subordinate to men, etc. And so you needed someone who sort of just challenged that whole paradigm and set out a whole new way of looking at the world. And so I think particularly those early feminist texts and subsequent ones have been enormously influential. And I've written, I hadn't mentioned, I've written about 7 books myself, and some of them have involved interviews, and one was looking at the impact of feminism a decade later in New Zealand. And so many women had listened. It was Germaine Greer. It was either reading her book, listening to her, you know, that suddenly they saw the world through different eyes. So it's almost like the feminist scholarship lifts the veil and enables women to see the world through a different lens, really. So I'd say that was the most important part of feminist scholarship.
Must have been quite exciting, because it wasn't just one author, but you know, there were many coming at the same.
Oh, that's what when I set up women's liberation at Auckland University, and we would all be sharing these texts, and it was so exciting, and it was so radical at the time. And when we went to speak about it, you know, it was shocking to men. And you know, as I mentioned in my book, that I recall Sharon and I speaking at an Auckland Rotary, and they were throwing condoms at us. You know, they were sort of, you know, outraged at this, and you know, we were ridiculed, and so I mean, it does take a particular personality to sort of withstand that sort of in those, particularly in the early days, that animosity, ridiculing, etc. But anyway, we were sort of drinking in those texts, and they were what enabled us to you know, to see the world. But also, of course, they outlined the agenda for change, which then, you know, we had developed our own manifestos. And it is ironic that, you know, it was really thanks to the American feminist movement, well, let's be honest. And Betty Friedan's book has to be mentioned. What was it called again?
Oh, you've got me there. I've got it on the bookcase somewhere. Betty
Friedan. Anyway, you know, Now and the Betty Friedan, etc. And they basically inspired women all around the world. And now we have, this 50, it is so astonishing to see that in a society like America, that you would be, going back effectively 50 years on the abortion issue, which it's not just about abortion. I mean, to me, the whole issue of abortion is about controlling women and putting women in their place and controlling women's bodies. So it's a fundamentally important issue about women's independence and autonomy, and that it could go backwards 50 years from the country which inspired feminism right around the world.
Right. And it's, so I mean, as you're speaking, it's interesting to see that the scholarship has inspired your activism, but it's inspired your scholarship as well. So it's not just a unidirectional relationship or even a bidirectional relationship between those things. It's more of a, we would call it maybe a mediational relationship. So you've got this overarching relationship from scholarship to scholarship, but also through activism.
Well, I'm a bit sort of skeptical of scholarship because it sounds a bit sort of academic and dispassionate. Stories, I mean, the stories of women have, inspire women and have inspired women over the past half century, and certainly, I mean, like Kate Millett's book, I think it's called, I've got them all here actually, Sexual Politics, I think it was called. I mean, her book was unquestionably scholarship. It really was scholarship, and it was, in a real depth. So some of it was, really academic scholarship, but a lot of the inspiration has just come from women sharing their stories and so forth, I would say.
Yeah, it's not just all theoretical.
But it is challenging the paradigm. I mean, basically, we had to challenge the whole paradigm of the patriarchy, and that did require a lot of deep thinking and research and scholarship. So yeah, it did have a very important role in doing that.
Right, yeah. But then it has to be translated in a way that can actually reach the people that it's supposed to reach.
And ironically, women's studies were a very big thing. In New Zealand, we had women's studies set up all over New Zealand, and they've basically got rid of all of them. And when I was researching for my book, 50 Years of Feminist, up at Victoria University, I noticed that they had this brilliant library of all these brilliant texts, and most of them were quite clearly unread because there was no women's studies anymore. And so if you looked at when were these books last out, it in many cases was some years ago, because without a women's studies, without that ongoing academic input and scholarship, that they were clearly, it was being neglected. Now they're starting again. I'm relieved to discover they have gender studies now. And so a lot of women are now doing gender studies, and hopefully men as well. Yes.
So one of the previous interviewees has talked about the dissolution of the women's studies program at Victoria University. But they also made a comment that there are women who are feminists in various other fields. It's just not all aggregated. They're not all aggregated in the same school or same department. So it almost reflects the women's movements. Okay, there's a theoretical thought for me to ponder later. Okay. So all right. This is going to be a silly question. Do you identify as a feminist?
I do.
So can you sort of elaborate on why? And I think you have, but is there anything that you've missed, any other comments about perhaps what drew you to be a feminist, or how that came about, or if that was just a natural?
But I've sort of explained that I read the book, had the feminist clique set up I just became a passionate women's liberationist, and I think a part of it too was just a strong sense of injustice, an outrage at the way women were treated, and wanting to change that.
Right.
And I think that when you put the women's movement in the context that for 6,000 years we had this, it was only recently, as I say to people, until 1884 in New Zealand, women had no legal personality. We were considered the property of men.
Right.
And men were entitled to rape us, to treat us. If we had children, it was their children. In every sense of the word, women were seen as the property of men. And sure, there were a few enlightened men around, but that basically was. And even though we were the first nation in the world, which much is made of, to get the vote in 1893, but getting the vote didn't really, we didn't challenge the status quo. In fact, the suffragettes were quite anxious to reassure men, don't worry, we're still going to be running the home, it's not going to affect you adversely, everything will be okay. And so much is made of getting the vote, but really it didn't bring about a great deal of significant change in New Zealand. So the National Council of Women was formed, and they focused on changing legislation, but they were at the margins. It was like getting a widow's benefit and raising the age of consent, and important things, but sort of little things. And it really wasn't until the 1970s that the women's liberation movement challenged the whole way society was organised, and challenged the idea that women were inferior, and that it was perfectly acceptable for women to take on men's names. It still astonishes me how many young women are getting married today and taking on their husbands' names, and not even thinking about it, so that we just grew up, took on men's identity, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I would, argue, that it's in the context that for literally thousands and thousands and thousands of years, the world was like Saudi Arabia is today, basically.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. Yeah.
So I think that the work women's has been hugely important, and I think it's important not only in terms of women but feminized. If you look at the conflicts and much of what is wrong in the world is that extreme macho male value system, etc. So if we were to civilize and improve society, the women's movement has done much to bring about change in that area as well.
Right. So thinking about the intersection of your work with the women's movement in this country and globally, so what do you think is going to be the future for feminism in New Zealand? What would your expectations or your analysis or evaluation be for feminism in New Zealand up next, maybe in the next 10 years, maybe 20 years?
Well, it's sort of quite hard to predict, because actually, as I again explain in my book, social movements wax and wane. You can't just sustain intense activism decade upon decade. And when you start to sort of achieve your goals, often the momentum is lost, because what's the problem? We've already achieved that. Also, within the women's movement, which we haven't talked about, there was a lot of ideological splits, and the movement sort of tore itself apart, which happened, oddly enough, almost in exactly the same way in America, in England, in New Zealand, I'm sure in Australia too. So that because we started off with such idealism, sisterhood is powerful, women working together, And then there was all these arguments over the treatment of lesbians, the treatment of Māori women, etc., etc. So the women's movement just sort of declined. Oh, and then, of course, we had some completely outside forces in the 90s. New Zealand went back into this neoliberalism and conservatism and so forth. And so for a convergence of reasons, the activism just sort of declined. And it really wasn't until 2010 that activism reasserted itself with the internet, with women linking up around the world. So I think it's hard to predict.
Right.
As I say, it waxes and wanes. It depends on women being prepared to feeling sufficiently motivated and passionate to put a lot of energy and time into the activism, because that's something which people forget. At the National Council of Women, I chair a particular group, and we were talking about things, organising a webinar on countering misogyny and things like this. But no one's prepared to do the donkey work, So, I mean, you have to have committed people. A lot of people are, believe in it, but are people really going to be motivated and activist enough? And on the one hand, some of the young women coming through today, I think it's some of them, you look at them, you think how extraordinary they are, and they'll be the leaders of tomorrow. And but actually, one of the reasons for the third and fourth wave of activism was these young girls were brought up saying women can do everything, girls can do anything. It became this slogan, and it was on bumper stickers and everything. And then they discovered, of course, at some point in their careers, that they couldn't do everything. They were still being heavily discriminated against. So it does depend on a lot of things. And on the one hand, as I was about to say, some young women, I think, are remarkable and have benefited hugely from the feminist revolution. But on the other hand, we now on the internet, we have Instagram, we have obsession with looks all over again, which is crippling to many young women. We have a huge upsurge in eating disorders. We have revenge porn. Whoever had heard of revenge porn? We have this misogynistic, internet they're putting up with the abuse and misogyny on the internet, and that's putting many young women off, for example, going into the public realm, going into politics. They don't want to be victims of the abuse that our Prime Minister and many other leading women experience. So every generation, we solve some issues, other issues arise, new problems emerge. And so, it just depends on, the waxing and waning of history. So I wouldn't like to make a prediction.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of, from what you're saying, it seems as though it's the time and the place and the interaction thereof. And so it depends on who's around when the issue arises. And for things like Me Too, the most recent sort of, thinking of that now, is really hoping that would have legs and keep moving. And it has had some impact. But I just would hope that it then continues. It's not, it doesn't recede totally into the background, but
I think it has fundamentally changed the whole sexual dynamics between men and women, and women feeling, there was such a sense of shame for women who had been sexually abused and feeling it was their fault. Right. And so I think it's had a huge global impact. Yeah. But again, it's not, you can't sustain Me Too forever.
Yes.
Things emerge, and it's like that just resonated globally. I mean, when I can't even remember her name, who published the thing about Me Too, and suddenly it's gone global. And the same thing happened with Laura Bates when she set up her website. everyday sexism.
Yes.
And, you know, suddenly all over the world, people are resonating and contributing. And it's, you know, so yeah, it's that sort of thing.
Yeah. Fair enough. That makes
and also, you know, maybe, you know, say, depends, are we still going to see all this misogyny? Because that's, or are men going to start changing? Because that's the other problem, as I've said all along. If one sex changes and the other stands still, you've got a problem. And that's been another major problem, is that women have changed, and we've you know, we've reevaluated and reinterpreted our roles, the female role, but men haven't done the same. And so we've got men still stuck with that old traditional, you know, role, and they haven't, and also all the incredible impact the male stereotype has had on men. So, you know, it also depends on men changing and growing and changing. And so if men did grow and change, and then there may not be such a need for a feminist movement. But at this stage, there's still a huge amount, you know, this has certainly not happened.
Right. I think, you know, to speak to that just a little, I think perhaps privately in certain, you know, there's little spots of that happening, little ways in men are changing, but not necessarily as publicly, perhaps as a women's movement. I mean, there were men's movements in the States, and I'm not sure that they sort of reached here, but it was more sort of reconnecting with, you know, inner feelings and that sort of thing. And these were big, perhaps in the 90s and early 2000s. I'm not sure.
They were very small here. Men sort of saw it as being, you know, effeminate, or you know, men were not comfortable. It never took off here in New Zealand.
And I mean, there's a big rugby culture here. Very much that.
And lads, I mean, you know, for all that my son has got some very good attitudes and so forth, he was still, when he went to Otago University, I could discover more in retrospect, in hindsight, that there were this drunken, laddish culture is still, you know, very strong.
Right. Yeah, agreed. So let's think now about the international forms of activism and scholarship that you've undertaken, and or stories, women's stories, not necessarily scholarship that you've undertaken. So, silly question. Do you still have connections with other activists or scholars or organisations in other countries?
I was, after I left left Parliament, I was on the board of UN Women for 9 years, and I connected and had some wonderful contacts with, and I was represented on the Asia Pacific committee of UN Women, so I used to fly to Bangkok every year and met up and became great friends with a Papua New Guinean a woman who's Lily Desua, who is an anti-violence activist in Papua New Guinea, with a woman from Nepal and other women activists. So I loved that. And I've kept in contact with Germaine Greer over the years. I think it's been 5 years ago since I last saw her. Gloria Steinem I've seen in recent times when she came to New Zealand, and kept a connection with her. And my friends from the UN, you know, so I've kept some contact with them, but that would be it.
Would be the extent of it. Okay. So thinking back to the connections that you had and the connections that you have, maybe less so now, do you have a sense of what the differences and similarities in the issues that are raised in different countries, what they were? So perhaps start with the differences as around feminism, perhaps. And you've spoken a little bit about that, but
interestingly, I mean, really, it was all set out at the International Women's Conference in Mexico in 1975, and you could see all of this sort of set out. So in the whole of Latin America, there was a group of women who were strong feminists, but there was also another group who was saying feminism is just a Western concept. Right. And the issues and actually Betty Friedan, unfortunately, she flew into Mexico, and she wanted to become the voice, the leader of global feminism. And so she got all these groups together and she came up with this agenda. But of course, it was a sort of American agenda about, you know, getting into parliament and childcare and whatever. And there were women saying, well, hang on a minute, you know, we women in Africa and that, our agenda is, you know, having some, we're sort of into sort of chopping wood and getting water and getting some help with, you know, we can't even think, it's survival. We can't even think about trying to get into our parliament. And in the Latin Americans, they said, oh, look, feminism is irrelevant. It's just a Western concept. We've got to focus on colonialism and racism. And so there was a huge debate and argument about that. Well, so what happened is they did focus to a great extent in many of these areas on racism and colonialism. But sooner or later, they had to confront the feminist agenda. And so in all of Latin America, you know, you have these huge, I mean, the feminist movement is probably more active in places in Latin America now than other countries. Mass marches against femicide. I mean, women are being killed every other day. Abortion, you know, campaigns for abortion. So they, it took some years for them because of to actually, I guess, embrace the feminist agenda, because there was so much saying, no, our agenda is racist. And also for Māori women, like Nahuia Te Awa Kotuku, who was one of the leaders of our women's liberation movement in Auckland. And she was very active, and she was a lesbian, so she was active in the lesbian movement too. But then she moved her focus to Ngā Tamatoa, to Māori sovereignty. And that was understandable, because as a Māori woman, and she suddenly realized that her whole sort of culture and language and whatever that were, you know, was being oppressed. So, you know, so for some women, it just sort of depends on the context of the nation, really. But ultimately, and it's the same, like in Nepal, the big issue there, and in much of Southeast Asia actually, was that menstruating women, and still in many, and certainly in one major province of Nepal, they are not allowed to be in the house. They have to go out into the you know, some cow shed or something while they're menstruating, and they feel you know, that it's like bleeding women is seen as this horrific thing, and you're not allowed. And even my friend, a feminist friend of mine, she wasn't supposed to be to touch food or be in the kitchen while she was menstruating. So you know, so that's a huge issue for her. In Papua New Guinea, just they don't even have safe houses. So, you know, when we began, when women's liberation, there was no rape crisis centres, there was no childcare, there was no women's refuges, you know. So all of those things emerged through the women's movement. And so in many parts of the world, like Papua New Guinea, they're starting at that level of trying to get some women's refuges, trying to get places for women to flee from male violence. So, you know, it depends on so much on the context of the country. But ultimately, you're up against the same attitudes that, you know, women are inferior and exist as extensions of men, you know, they're men's property, and they're there to serve men. And so you see that in every country on earth.
Thanks, great answer. I think that we have actually come to the end of my scripted questions. Do you have any sort of closing comments that anything we've not touched on that you'd like to say about feminism or your career or your part in it?
No, not really, except in terms of, I would say in terms of scholarship, in terms of my book, I think one thing that there hasn't been much focus on, which is motherhood. And I did, one book was on the history of motherhood. And a lot of women actually sort of felt that somehow feminists were rejecting motherhood. And there was a lot of, concern about that we were undermining motherhood. But when in the 1960s and 70s, you had women in New Zealand, and I'm sure it was the case all around the world, women were isolated in their homes being mothers. And, the expectation was that they would give up their job and they would spend the rest of their lives looking after children and being mothers. But there was no support, there was no childcare, there were not and so motherhood, huge numbers of women before feminism were depressed as mothers. And we had this wonderful man called Dr. Fraser MacDonald, who was head of the largest psychiatric institution in New Zealand. And he helped give credibility to the feminist movement enormously because he was very radical and outspoken. And he said, most women are slaves. And he said, and huge numbers of women were on Valium, that was called Mother's Little Helper.
Yeah.
And he said, there were streets with women who were depressed because they were isolated at home with young children all day, with no real role or purpose in life. And so they were, in a way, they were being terrible mothers because they were so unhappy. Right. And so I would argue that, but in my case, by delaying motherhood until I was 42, considered almost a geriatric mother, by that stage, I think I was very fortunate because by then there was childcare, and there was very good childcare available in New Zealand. Women were, there was also this big thing that, what was it called? Sort of separation. Women felt guilty if they left their child for sort of half an hour. Maternal deprivation was this huge theory of maternal deprivation, that all children would suffer if they were away from their mother for for 5 minutes or more. And so you had all these women sort of guilty if they left their child for half an hour. And so I would argue that feminism has actually enormously benefited motherhood because it has enabled women to be mothers without having to be depressed, without having to give up everything in their lives. And then mothers groups, for me, when I was a mother, my most important thing in my life was my mother's group. And our mother's group for 5 years, we met every Friday, and we still continue to meet.
Oh, you do?
So so we set up these support networks all around New Zealand. Women didn't have support networks. So yeah. I just think that's one thing that not enough credibility is given to how feminism has actually, I think, enabled women to be better mothers. And of course, really it should be about being better parents. It should be the shared parenting.
Yeah.
It shouldn't all fall on the mother and then she's guilty and she's trying to do her job and trying to, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, there is still a huge amount of unfinished business with feminism. But yeah. I just wanted to mention that I think it's rather overlooked how I think women are better mothers as a result of feminism, rather than there was a feeling that we were undermining and devaluing motherhood.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. Yes, and these days you certainly weren't a geriatric mother. Perhaps it's unusual to be 42 and have your first child, and perhaps your only child, but yeah. My mum was 42, but I'm the last of 5.
Right,
so
exactly.
yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful, and I will stop recording now. Thanks.
Right.